Good evening, students. Ed Gurus brings to you The Portrait of a Lady, written by Khushwant Singh, from your textbook Flamingo. From your textbook Hornbill. The Portrait of a Lady. When you read the portrait meaning, I hope you all know, you must be thinking of a picture, a photo frame, a painting hanging on the wall. Yes, portrait means the same. But here the portrait is a pen picture of a lady. Pen picture meaning character description, a character sketch of a lady. And that lady is none other than very dear grandmother of the writer Khushwant Singh. Before we read the lesson, let us know about Khushwant Singh, who is a familiar name, who is very famous for his work. He was born in 1915 and died in 2014. He was a famous novelist, journalist, diplomat, and a lawyer. He was best known for his literary works. He was the recipient of Padma Vibhushan Award and Sahitya Akademi Fellowship. He wrote his most notable work, his book, Train to Pakistan, recalling his experiences of the partition of India. Because he was a close witness and who experienced the partition of India in 1947. He was the editor of several reputed newspapers and magazines, such as the Illustrated Weekly of India, the National Herald, and Hindustan Times. He had been writing a column with malice towards one and all in the Hindustan Times. This column was widely read and was famous for his wit and wisdom. Khushwant Singh was known for his wit and wisdom, not only because of this column, but otherwise also. His writings, they are the real evidence of his wit and wisdom. Let's read the story now, The Portrait of a Lady. In this story, The Portrait of a Lady, Khushwant Singh, the writer, he has paid a tribute to his grandmother. He has described a beautiful bonding and understanding between the grandmother and the grandson. He has given the three phases of his relationship with his grandmother. In the first phase, how he spent his childhood time with his grandmother. The second phase, from the village when they moved to city, there was a change. And the third phase was when he went to university. Again, there was a change. What was the change? That you will read and you will find. He has concluded the story with a very touching note where he had described the moving death of his grandmother. If you read the story, you will come to know he has touched upon two major themes of the story. One is that elderly people also feel and need companionship and friendship. And the second theme is that love and emotions are not only experienced by humans, but the birds and animals, they also have these feelings. Let's find out how these have been highlighted in the story. Right in the beginning, you have got a list of some expressions in the text. You will get to know their meanings when you read them in a particular context. But before we start reading, I think you should know the meaning. The first one is the thought was almost revolting. The thought was almost revolting, meaning it was difficult to believe. It was unacceptable. An expanse of pure white serenity. Pure white goes with serenity. Serenity meaning calmness, quiet, peace. So it refers to definitely the grandmother, that she was an embodiment of peace, a turning point, a change. Accepted her seclusion with resignation. Grandmother accepted her seclusion. Seclusion when she felt isolated. Because the grandson was given another room, which otherwise both the grandmother and the grandson they were sharing. So grandmother was isolated. She accepted that isolation with resignation, meaning she did not complain, she did not protest. A veritable bedlam of chirpings. Veritable bedlam, loud noise, loud chaos by the chirping of the birds. Frivolous rebukes. Rebukes are scoldings. Frivolous, lightly, not serious, casual. Casual scoldings. The sagging skins of the dilapidated drum. The sagging, loose. Loose skin of the dilapidated and old drum, which is not in good condition. Now, here is the story. The story is in a biographical form. Who is the narrator is not known. But yes, Khushwant Singh has written about his grandmother, not only in this story, but in other stories too. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. The very first sentence, he says, my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. He is absolutely right, students. When you read, you will see the image of your own grandmother in the writer's grandmother. A very general behavior of grandmothers has been depicted in the story. That's why he said, my grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. When you talk about grandmother, the thought comes, must be an old woman. So he says, just as the image of the grandmother is that she must be an old woman. So like others' grandmother, my grandmother was also an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. The writer, for 20 years, he had seen his grandmother. He was 20 years old. He said that he had always seen her old. He had always seen her face wrinkled. He had always seen her as grandmother. So he had always seen her as old with a wrinkled face. People said that she had once been young and pretty and had even had a husband, but that was hard to believe. He heard from the people, his parents also must have told him, that once grandmother was young and beautiful. She was married, she had a husband. But for the for the writer, it was difficult to believe. Why? Because he had always seen his grandmother old. The lady, an old lady with a wrinkled face. Because he had never seen her young. He had never seen her as beautiful as a young lady is. So he had not seen the beauty of a young woman in her. So it was difficult for him to believe that once she was also beautiful and young. That expresses the writer's innocence. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. My grandfather's portrait, yes, here portrait is what you think a photo or a picture. His grandfather's portrait, the picture, was hanging above the mantelpiece. Mantelpiece is a shelf in the drawing room. In that picture, he wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years old. Now, what is it? What was he looking like? In a big turban, loose clothes, having a long white beard. To him, he appeared to be as if he was 100 years old, meaning the grandfather appeared to be very old. He did not look the sort of a person who would have a wife or children. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. So when he looked at the grandfather's picture, he could not believe that the man was ever young or the man ever had a wife or the children. He thought right from the beginning he was a grandfather, he was an old man with lots and lots of grandchildren. Because he had this depicts that child as a child. The writer had an image of the grandparents as old grandmother or old grandfather. So it was difficult for him to believe that grandparents could also be once young and beautiful or handsome. As for my grandmother, being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. He says, so far as my grandmother is concerned, it's very difficult for me to accept. It's very difficult for me to believe that grandmother was ever young and beautiful. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child that seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. His grandmother, many a times, she would share her childhood experiences with the writer. She would tell him what kind of games she used to play as a child. But to the writer, that seemed quite absurd. But he would consider those anecdotes shared or narrated by the grandmother as absurd, as inappropriate and undignified. Undignified, he would not consider them important. They were not considerable for him. Why? Because he thought the grandmother to be an old woman. He could not accept that she had been playing games. He had that very image of an old woman of the grandmother. So he could never think that old woman could also be playing some games. That's why he found it very inappropriate and undignified. And we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. So when she was narrating her own childhood experiences, when she was sharing her childhood anecdotes with the writer, he would consider it, he would take it as a story from mythology. Grandmother, she was God-fearing woman, she was very religious minded, so she would tell the writer a number of stories of the prophets, of the gurus, of the religious leaders from mythology. So he would take it simply as a narration, as a story. He would not consider it a real life experience of the grandmother, right? She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. In the first paragraph, you learned about the appearance of the grandmother, how the appearance of the grandmother makes it difficult for the writer to accept that she was also young and pretty once. In the second paragraph, here the writer describes the physical appearance of the grandmother more vividly. She had been short, fat. You learned that she was old She had a wrinkled face. Now, here it is, she was short, she was fat, and she was stooped, slightly bent because of the old age. Her face was a crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere. Crisscross of wrinkles running from everywhere to everywhere, meaning the face was completely wrinkled. One could see only wrinkles on her face. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. No, we were certain. We were sure. She had always been old as we had known her, meaning since the writer had started knowing and understanding, he had seen the grandmother as an old woman. So he says, I'm sure that she had always been old, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. He is not ready to believe that she was ever young. At the same time, he does not think that the grandmother would have grown older than what he had seen. He thinks that she had been old as he had found her, and she could not have grown older than her present being, and she had always been the same age. There had been no change in her physical personality. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. This is very important statement, students. In the whole lesson, you will come across many such statements, and the questions that you get in the examination are usually based on these statements. Now, the writer says she could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She was not pretty, but she was beautiful. Now, pretty means also beautiful, but pretty here means physically. She never looked beautiful. Why? Because she had a wrinkled face. So wrinkles had hidden her beauty. Her beauty has been concealed by the wrinkles on her face. So this is what he thought, that she had never been looking beautiful. Yet he says she was always beautiful. Now, what is the difference between pretty and beautiful here? Try to understand. Pretty means beautiful looks. She did not have beautiful looks, but she was beautiful at heart. First, pretty is her physical beauty. And second, beautiful is her inner beauty, the beauty of her heart. She was beautiful at her heart. She was a beautiful soul. She was a beautiful person. When we say a person, someone is a beautiful person, it does not mean that we are considering one beautiful because of one's beautiful looks. No, some beautiful traits in one's personality make him beautiful. So is the case with grandmother, as highlighted by her grandson. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop and the other telling the beads of her rosary. She hobbled, she wandered, she walked around her house. She would always keep roaming around in her whole house. In spotless white, he is describing his outfits. He is describing her clothes which she used to wear. That she would always be seen in white attire, purely white dress she would wear. And she would move around in the house. How? How would she be walking around? With one hand putting on her waist to balance her stooped shoulder. She had stoop shouldered because of old age. You must have noticed these very changes in your grandmother or grandfather. She would often say she would be found wearing purely white dress all the time, moving around with one hand putting on her waist and the other hand telling the beads of her rosary. The rosary is a string of beads that often you will find the grandmothers chanting the beads. Let me say, मनकों की माला, जो बड़े लोग बुजुर्ग लोग मनकों की माला जो जपते हैं, that is called telling the beads of her rosary. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. Her silver locks are the bunch of hair. Silver, now these silver locks, grandmother's hair has been described as silver locks. Why? Because they were gray. Now do remember, children, that when the hair turns white, actually we call it gray. We do not say that he or she has white hair. We say gray hair. So that gray hair of grandmother has been described as silver locks. The curled bunches of the hair, that is called lock. So he describes her hair as silver because they had turned gray. Her gray hair was scattered untidily. Now, one thing I would like to tell here, locks were. Locks is the plural form, so were has been used. But with hair, we do not use were. And we do not call it hairs also. It is used singular hair for hair, right? It is a lock of hair, locks of hair, but hair only. So her hair was scattered, strewn, untidily, shabbily over her pale. Her face was pale. Why pale? Because pale meaning weak, feeble. Why weak? Because of the old age. Her face was looking pale, weak, and puckered face, puckered, wrinkled face. She had wrinkled face. She was looking weak. If you look at her face, and these grey hair of her had been shabbily scattering over her face. Maybe that she had not been able to comb them properly, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. And you would always find her lips moving, chanting prayer. Chanting prayer which was inaudible, meaning which could not be heard. Always moving her lips. Nowadays, you people use the term very often, lip syncing. You would always find her lip syncing with the prayers that could not be heard. But yes, when you watch her lip syncing, you can make out that she is singing prayer. So what does it depict? She was telling the beads of her rosary. She had been constantly chanting her prayers. What does it mean? That she was a God-fearing woman, a divine woman, a religious-minded woman. So her devotion to religion and God, her faith in spirituality, that also has made her look beautiful. And here the writer says, yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity breathing peace and contentment. The poet had described her beauty. He has compared her beauty with the winter landscape in the mountains. Now, how is this winter landscape in the mountains? In winters, the mountains, what is the landscape? The mountains are covered with snow. So they are purely white. So what he means to say that grandmother was also an expanse of pure white serenity. Her white attire, her white dress, white cloth she wore, her grey hair, and her religious mindedness would make her peace loving, peaceful, would make her pure, and she would become an embodiment of tranquility, peace. Right? So this white dress, gray hair, and her devotion to God, her devotion to religion, that has exuded. That has exuded what? The grandmother's serenity. She appeared to be an expanse of, an embodiment of peace and contentment. She was always at peace and she was always content. So, this is another characteristic of grandmother's character we have got to know, right? My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. Here in this passage, now you are going to read about the writer's bonding with his grandmother. This is the first phase of his bonding with his grandmother. That is when the parents had left to the city and the writer was left with his grandmother. He was under the care of his grandmother, and how he had spent his childhood days under the care of his grandmother. That had developed a beautiful bonding of friendship between the grandmother and the writer. They were always together. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. Every day, she would take care of every need of the writer. She would wake him up, she would get him ready for the school. Not only that, she said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. She would start her morning with the morning prayers. In a very faint voice, she would sing, she would chant her prayers. And when she was dressing up the writer, her grandson, she was hopeful that he must be listening to the prayer and that's how he would learn it by heart. That's very true, children. Just imagine, just try to understand. We never have learned from a book or in a class our day-to-day prayers or artis or bhajans that we sing. Where did we get it from? When we had listened to our elders chanting the same. So the writer says, I listened because I loved her voice, but never bothered to learn it. He said that he would listen to her chanting of the prayers because he loved her voice, but he never cared to learn it. How honest the writer is. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a red pen, tie them all in a bundle and hand it to me. Grandmother, she would make it sure before going to school that his bag is packed with everything. That he has kept wooden slate, which is plastered with yellow chalk, ink pot, red pen, everything she would pack in his bag. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to school. She would give him breakfast, the nutritious one. She would take care of it. And after the breakfast, they would go to school. So she does make it sure that he takes breakfast too. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs. Stale chapatis may be the leftovers of the previous day. She would keep them, collect them, and when they were going to the school, grandmother would carry those stale chapatis also. She would not let them go waste, but she would feed the stray dogs with those stale chapatis. So this was the first phase of beautiful bonding between the grandmother and her grandson, the writer. And now we will end up here, and the rest we shall continue the next week on Thursday at the same time. Till then, goodbye and thank you.